welcome to this Come to Jesus Daily Devotional as we continue in the book of Ephesians and this important subject of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Today's devotion is entitled, The Body is Designed to Grow. The body is designed to grow. We're going to see today that it's Jesus' will that the church grows. However, we must allow Jesus to teach us what true growth is. We must allow Jesus to teach us what true growth is. Let's read from Ephesians 4 verse 16. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Firstly, I want us to notice growth comes from him. From him, the whole body grows. True Christian growth is empowered, enabled by Jesus. Our salvation and our sanctification are all the gift of Jesus. He's the one. By the power of the Spirit can any growth truly happen. I mean, the Psalm says, unless the Lord builds the house, the labourers labour in vain. And we bring that into the New Testament. Unless the Lord builds the body, the labourers labour in vain. It's he who builds up his church. Growth comes from him. And if we want to be this kind of church that grows, then we need to do what we've seen previously. We saw in our previous devotion, we talked about being connected to the head as closely as possible through prayer, through fellowship, through obedience. Many ways we can be as closely connected to the head as possible. And it's through that, being connected to him, that the church grows. Let's be as close to Jesus as possible. And so I think many times when we talk about growth, right, we think about numbers of people coming on a Sunday, numbers of people coming to these various events. Now, of course, growth is a good thing in numbers, but unfortunately, we can see, can't we? We can gather a crowd for all the wrong reasons. We can gather a crowd and entertain them in ungodly ways, you see, because in the end, a massive crowd of selfish people is not God's will, and that's not the kind of growth that pleases God. So as we begin, let's remember, growth, true spiritual growth comes from our head, comes from Jesus. Let's be as close to him as possible. But secondly, true growth is loving service. See, we've got to learn to allow God to define growth. It's important to understand what is meant by growth. As I've said, oftentimes we think of numbers or money or whatever it is. There's lots of ways that the world would define true success. But crowds are not necessarily success. I mean, there were massive crowds at the crucifixion of Jesus, wasn't there? Shouting, crucify him, crucify him. That wasn't a successful church, I hasten to add. We've got to build what is true growth. And true Christian growth is expressed in these terms. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up as each part does its work. So we can see three elements here of at least three things that speak of true Christian growth, true church growth that pleases God. Firstly, true growth is growing closer to Jesus. As we've already spoken about, it's being connected to Jesus, the head, as closely as possible through prayer, through being filled with his presence, through obedience, through loving relationship with him. So that's the first true growth that comes as the gifts of the Spirit do their work, I hasten to add. Secondly, growth is growing closer to one another. It says the whole body joined and held together by every supporting ligament. There's no church growth No true church growth where there's not a growth in fellowship, loving fellowship. If we don't love one another, we are an immature, failing church. No matter how big the crowd is, if we're not in fellowship, if we're not loving one another, then we're not growing. The whole body needs to be joined together. That's the second aspect of growth. Thirdly, growth is growing in loving service. As we read here, the body builds itself up as each part does its work. So we've been talking about the gifts of the Holy Spirit. True growth is when each of us uses the gifts that God has given us to sacrificially serve one another for the good of the whole church. That's true growth. How do I know if I'm mature? Well, I'm growing in maturity the more I say no to myself and yes to serving others and using my gifts to sacrificially serve them. How do we know the church is growing in maturity? Because we are saying no to many things and we're saying yes to using our gifts to serve one another. Like Christ, laying down our lives for one another. That is true Christian growth. So in response, finally, if these aspects of true growth are in place, then numbers will inevitably follow. As we focus on these qualities, then quantity will follow. If we're seeking to be close to Jesus, our head, if we're seeking to be close to one another in fellowship, if we're seeking to serve one another with the gifts of the Holy Spirit, then inevitably growth will follow. As we read in Acts 2, where we see this example of such a church. And it finishes with Acts 2:47. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. God bless you.